The debate was short. It had to be, or else the vote would never take place. It's probably worth quickly going over how the city council worked in those days. Basically, the city was divided into 100 sectors. We wanted to keep it as simple as possible, so 100 delegates, each one representing a sector, would meet in the council hall. Each community would have nominated 10% of their members to speak their mind. So, in the vote regarding me staying on as steward, the New Londoners had 5 speakers, the Frostlanders 4, and the Stalwarts only 1. It's worth bearing in mind, of course, that these communities were not political parties, and they certainly were not wholly united, in a traditional sense, of course. 2 delegates from the same community might disagree and vote against each other on any given subject. After the 10 speakers had each had their 1 minute, the vote would happen. Within the building, each community also had a large office assigned to them, where their delegates could discuss before going to the hall for the vote. It was also in these offices that I could speak my mind and make certain city or citizenry related offers, perhaps in the form of a compromise to secure more votes from the communities. It was a kind of blackmail or bribe, depending on which way you looked at it, but it wasn't dirty secretive stuff, but rather a way for communities to be heard and a chance for them to give ideas. It was also where each delegate could give their preliminary voting intention if they wished. And it was the collective result of this preliminary poll that gave me something of a headache, and led me to make a compromise with the New Londoners in order to secure more votes. I promised them I would instruct our researchers to look into the feasibility of machine-centric shifts, as they called it, and then of course to hold a vote on its implementation at the next council session. The proposal simply meant that workers' shifts could be shortened due to the readily available machinery remaining powered up throughout day and night. Again, you may see this compromise as a bribe of sorts. Understand, I had to oversee the voted decision on not necessarily the future of New London, but the future of my own life. If the vote went against me, it wouldn't be a case of handing over my office, drawing a lot for one of the districts, and going off to work in a mine or a hothouse. It would mean me having to leave the city, like so many others had been forced to do so under the captain's rule. I had to remain impartial to the debate. I was not welcome to speak my own opinion, nor defend myself against the scathing verbal attacks from 1 or 2 delegates. Nevertheless, the vote passed with a near 2-to-1 advantage. I would remain a steward, and of course remain in New London. But it's worth mentioning that 1 member from each community now got the chance for a closing remark, and the delegate from the Frostlanders community clearly was not happy with the result. He stood up, took a deep breath, appearing to inflate like a balloon. He then turned to me, sitting in the steward's box, and launched a very fiery attack against me, an impartial observer of all things. Why should we put up with people like him for any longer? It is due to the likes of him, he said, pointing a prosthetic arm at me, that has held back the people for a generation. We could have become true survivors, true residents of the Frostlands, if it weren't for him and his kind. Who, or what, gave the captain the right to make him steward anyhow? Chuck him out, I say, and let the people take the reins properly. The captain's authority had been such that this remark, even now approaching a year since he died, caused the mass delegates to take a sharp intake of breath. Realising he may have gotten carried away, this delegate now held up his hands in a placatory manner. With this, he took his seat, thus bringing proceedings to a close. But it had confirmed to me what I had already begun to fear. Within the Frostlanders community, trouble was beginning to stir. I perceived a terrifying dark cloud over the city, darker than the darkest smoke spewing out from the coal-powered generator, and perhaps 10 times as toxic. I felt that if my feeling of impending trouble and my fears should become justified, my best bet would be to keep the New Londoner community, and the stalwarts of course, happy. Together, these two groups amounted to almost 60% of the city's population. Having the larger of the two diverging factions behind me should in theory increase my chances of survival should the worst happen. With all that in mind, I sent an aide from the council hall to the research institute with orders to immediately begin researching and developing methods of bringing in the New Londoners' proposal for machine-centric shifts. All this before proceedings at the council hall had even completely finished. Whilst that was going on, we set to work building up a new logistics district on the outskirts of the city. It was in March of 1917 that the Research Institute finally released their completed plans for the continuous powering of machinery to allow for machine-centric shifts, and it passed into law with 62% of the delegates voting for it. Keeping my promises to New Londoners had restored a good deal of their faith in me after I'd been forced to fleece them for their heat stamps last year. I had also endeared myself to the stalwarts too, but now new complaints began to reach me. Our food stockpile was severely depleted, and we were not producing enough to feed everyone what they needed to survive, not with the workloads they had to carry out anyway. For now, it was simply another issue to add to the growing list. In order for New London to continue sustaining life, we would have to once again send teams out into the Frostlands. The logistics districts were vital for these expeditions. Despite the Frostlands appearing to be nothing but a frozen wasteland, it actually held a huge wealth of resources. Resources we'd have to tap into in order to survive. I'd had high hopes that our Frostland expedition teams, now leaving the city, might solve many of our problems. One of the first things I'd ordered them to do was head straight to the nearby encampment, where many of our people, expelled during the captain's reign, had taken shelter. They were welcome to return to New London, now that the captain was gone and more city infrastructure was already in place. I can guess what you're thinking as you read this. I've been complaining about the lack of all resources, supplies and space since the start of this ruddy melancholic tale. Well, I saw people as another of New London's thinly stretched resources. And though we already had a food shortage and a housing crisis on our hands, I felt we weren't about to fix either problem unless we had the people, the workers, to do it. But back to the Frostland teams, their main priority was to find New London an alternative long-term fuel source for the generator. The best strategy for doing this, in my opinion, was to have as many expeditionary teams out exploring the Frostlands as New London could support. So a second logistics district was planned in the southern outskirts. More teams out there meant more eyes on the search, and more hands to begin building an outpost when something was eventually found.
The stalwarts encourage all citizens to join in their daily roll call.
At the end of May, it was once again time for the city's delegates to meet once more. Except this time, following the fairly recent arrival of the New Londoners from the nearby encampment, the Frostlander delegates had lost a lot of their number. On its own, the New Londoner community made up nearly 60% of the city's population. The stalwarts, who were very much aligned with the New Londoners, made up an additional 9%. The proposal that I'd put to the council was for the introduction of mandatory schooling for all of the city's children. It would no longer be the responsibility of parents to educate their children, either academically or in any specific line of work. However, it was only the stalwarts that supported this idea outright, with many New Londoners and Frostlanders being somewhat hesitant. The preliminary intended voting results didn't look particularly great, and despite them now making up about 1/3 of the city, I decided to approach the Frostlanders to see if there was anything I could do to sway them. I didn't want them to feel oppressed in any way, so I gave them the option to choose the next session's agenda, passing them a proverbial length of rope as they floundered about in this pool of misery, not realising at the time that this length of rope was long enough for them to metaphorically hang me. you live and learn, I suppose. And so with that agreement made, the law passed with a whopping 79% of the vote. Through the months of June and early July, the temperature plummeted. We had nearly 200 die of the cold or cold-related injuries. Plus, the list of sick citizens began to grow longer. A new kind of tension began to grip the city. And then, to make matters worse, there was a devastating fire in one of the coal mines, caused of course by our blast mine practices, which naturally involved using explosives. A reasonable risk, but now I had to make a choice. Cut off oxygen to the mine, thus saving the deposit, leaving them to suffocate before they could escape, or rescue the miners at the cost of a large supply of coal in the mine. We'd all had to make sacrifices, or else we wouldn't be here, but for me the choice was simple. Get them out! I ordered the stalwarts. Things were bleak, but they were about to get a lot bleaker. It was time for the Frostlander community to propose the next council agenda. I cannot lie, I'd been dreading this moment, and the Frostlanders did not disappoint. They proposed a community service law for supporting expeditions. If it hadn't been for our desperate need for alternative fuel, I would have refused to even consider the proposal. The preliminary response was that the proposal would be soundly defeated. But I saw this as an opportunity to win further favour with the New Londoners. I agreed to have our researchers develop a new district heat dispatcher. With things as cold as they were, boosting the generator's output was worth doing. Plus, our expeditionary teams could use extra support. We desperately needed a success story from them, so with the deal made with the New Londoners, the law passed. I may have put a positive spin on this latest council session, but really it was anything but positive. My recent acquiescence to the Frostlander proposals seemed to have emboldened a small number from the community. These were of a more extremist ilk, the far left in our frozen and warped political horseshoe. They called themselves the Pilgrims.
Now officially recognized by the city. Pilgrim delegates will be joining the next council session.
They demanded that they be heard in council. They had enough of a following to grant them 4 delegates in council by our rules, but it would come at a cost to the Frostlander numbers. Though Pilgrim numbers were at this time small in number, they were both very loud and very uncompromising. Things were already bad enough. Expeditionary teams were finding little but scraps, and people in the city were freezing to death. Now these Pilgrim fools would like nothing less than for us to abandon our generator altogether. The beating heart of the city lost, if we let them have their way. Complaints of hunger were also rising, enough that I had to sign orders for construction of a new food district, using up more valuable resources we could ill afford. At last, it was in October of 1917 that some good news finally reached me. One of our Frostland teams signalled that they had found the old children's coal mine. Teams from the old Outpost 11 originally found this cave complex some 30 odd years ago, inhabited and organised by children who'd been lost in the Frostlands when the Great Storm had struck. They had built barely sufficient shelters in the caves and had mined deeper. They had survived. Eventually, they had become citizens of New London. Some of those children were now, of course, the fully grown, hardy members of the Frostland expeditionary teams who had once again found their old home. We signalled them to use materials from the mine to mark a trail back to the city, a Frostland highway of sorts. This mine could prove to be just the thing we needed at this time. We would build a new outpost at the mine and begin to transport shipments of coal back to New London. Of course, it wouldn't last forever, but for now, it would take the sting out of freezing to death. Unfortunately, even with the materials from the mine, we lacked the necessary resources to complete the trail marking right away. Extremely frustrating, but there was nothing that could be done at the moment. Meanwhile, back in the city, things continued to worsen. Whilst everyone spent their work-free time worrying about whether or not their family would starve to death or freeze, the city delegates continued their pantomime in the council hall. The latest debate being about the best way to produce goods for citizens. I sat throughout the debate, my cheek resting on my left fist, knowing the debate was completely pointless because I also knew that there weren't any materials available for the production of private citizen goods anyway. The city outside was simultaneously freezing and starving to death. The tension was approaching breaking point. All whilst these fools held their lapels as they talked in the warmish council hall. The city was dying, but only I seemed to be aware of it.